So, good morning and good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. My name is Tammy Seaver, and I am the Social Services Chief for the State of Nevada's Elder Protective Services. And I'm very proud to say, though, starting July 1st, we will be officially expanded to a full adult program. I'm a Western Regional representative, and also a member of the National Adult Protective Services Association. I also serve as chair for the Regional Representative Advisory Board. This webinar will provide strategies for staff to reduce risk when they encounter challenging or potentially threatening situations that involve upset, emotionally charged, or angry clients or others they may have contact with.
Thank you, Tammy. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jason Knizzo. I serve as a Deputy Director for the National Adult Maltreatment Reporting System and the Adult Protective Service Technical Assistance Resource Center, also called APS TARC for short. Before we begin, I want to thank Dan and ACL and all the folks at NAPSA and the Technical Assistance Resource staff for all their hard work. Without their work and support, presentations like this wouldn't be possible. So again, thank you. For those not familiar with NAMERS or the APS TARC, they're projects funded by ACL, operated by WRMA, and we make every effort to align information with their goals and objectives. But please note that any findings, conclusions, or points of views expressed during this presentation may not necessarily represent those of ACL or the Department of Health and Human Services. A little bit about the APS TARC. It was created to help increase the knowledge, awareness, and effectiveness of APS programs. We offer a variety of services that include peer support, information and research, educational opportunities, such as this webinar, and also technical assistance. We're supported by a large network of resource and collaborators, including partnerships with organizations like NAPSA, educational institutions, and other resource centers, all to improve APS programs. So that means we're here to assist you in any way we can, and the best part of that is it's free. So we encourage you to contact us, even if it's just to discuss what we do or how we can help support your organization. We also recommend you joining our listserv or following us on social media. We're on all Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn social media sites. For more information on how to contact us, the last page in the presentation includes our email, website, and links to our social media accounts. The last thing I want to say before I hand it over to Lori is I want to thank everyone participating today. And I know it's going to be a great presentation and full of useful information. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori to talk a little bit about some of the housekeeping. Thank you.
All right. Well, this is Lori Delagrammaticus, the Executive Director of NAPSA, and I have to tell you, this is our largest audience ever. Over close to 700 people registered for this this webinar. So I need to let you know the session is being recorded and will be posted online. We are not taking individual questions with 600 people on the line. So we ask that you type any questions you have in the question box. If you have problems hearing, you can either go in, if you haven't been able to connect with your computer audio, there's a telephone number to dial in, but you are going to be on mute. You won't be able to speak. You're going to have to type questions. Next slide, please, Jason. All right, Tammy, would you like to introduce our speaker, please?
Certainly, I will read this brief but exciting bio of Dan Elliot. Dan Elliot is a personal safety professional with 25 years experience. He provides people with insights and strategies for understanding themselves and others as a way of communicating more clearly, improving relationships, coping with stress, and setting powerful boundaries. Through the use of humor and insight, Dan is able to bring his energetic and engaging approach to make sense of why people behave the way they do, what can be done to understand, even appreciate them, and get along better with them. He prepares professionals who come in contact with upset, angry, or emotionally charged clients, customers, or tenants to be safe and productive in challenging situations. Dan has traveled across the United States and internationally, working with agencies and businesses of all sizes, focusing on the areas of interpersonal safety, congruent communication, and customer service. Dan was born in Columbus, Ohio, not his choice, and continues to reside there, certainly his choice, which is a very nice place to live if you like college football and extremes of weather. And I will now turn the webinar over to Dan.
Thank you, Tammy. I appreciate that. But I appreciate all the people who behind the scenes who have made this webinar possible, and I welcome all the participants. So I have quite a bit of material, about 35 hours of training material on personal safety on the job in less than an hour to share that with you. So my goal here is to share as much as I can, hit the highlights and the high points, and then there are some handouts you can download that will go into more detail on some of these. So let's get into this. Oftentimes, hang on a second. Little technical glitch. When we talk about personal safety and self-defense, a lot of times we use boundary setting or personal safety. We'll just leave that there. And people sometimes use them interchangeably, but most often people use the term self-defense. And when I say self-defense, people often think of physical self-defense, karate chop, Bruce Lee, those kinds of things. But I want to give you a different definition of self-defense. I'm going to have Jason take over the slides because it's acting up on my computer.
Sure.
Yeah. And as soon as you have control of it, let me know.
Yep.
So I'd like to be on slide 10, I believe, with the road sign.
We are.
Okay, so here's my definition of self-defense. It's any time you make a decision to keep yourself physically or emotionally and psychologically safe. It's just not the physical self-defense. It's how people treat us when they cross those personal boundaries. You know, someone actually physically harming us, there's a possibility of that, but it's most likely people are crossing our boundaries to get what they want, and they don't care or don't realize they are. So it's more than just the physical self-defense aspect. Also, there's a graphic on the screen of a road sign about self-defense. And I consider personal self-defense, particularly for case managers, the same way I look at defensive driving. That when you're in your car driving down the highway, you're paying attention to your self-defense, your defensive driving, your safety as you're driving. You're doing things like maintaining speed with flow of traffic. You're looking for distance between the car ahead of you, enough distance. You're checking your rearview mirrors, using your turn indicators, all those things. And you may even be doing some preventative self-defense or safe driving things like maintaining a good vehicle, good tires, air in your tires, all that. Well, personal safety on the job, I think it's the same way, that you pay attention the whole time. And just like driving down the highway, there are things you can do in the moment, like paying attention to your environment. There's also things you can do ahead of time, like looking at a case file ahead of time or finding about the person you'll be in front of. So it's very, very similar. It's something you want to do all the time. And just like driving, when your risks go up, you pay more attention. If you see traffic building up, a construction zone, you see emergency equipment down the road, things like that, or you're driving in bad weather, you adjust. You adjust your based upon your risk. Well, the same thing is true with your personal safety on the job. It's something you're paying attention to, something you're aware of, and when the risks go up, you pay more attention. I also use this road sign. There's one path we can go on, the emotional psychological path, which we can hopefully maintain a safe and productive meeting or interaction with this client. The other path is to go to the physical, and that's the path we generally want to avoid. It's just a lot more law involved, judges and juries and things like that. So the idea is to try to stay on the path of the emotional psychological defense so we can be productive and safe with people. Next slide, please. So when it comes to this, it's not just who, it's where we are. And oftentimes in our environment, we stop paying attention. And it's critical to pay attention. We have this thing where we get familiar with something and we drop our guard. They used to call it muscle memory. It's now procedural memory. And many of us have experienced this when you're driving from work to home and you can't remember the trip. I mean, you could read a book because the car knows the way, you know. And of course, it can get even more deep than that when we are driving home from work and then there's a stop we have to make before we get home. We have to stop off at the grocery store or something to pick something up we need, and we consciously know we have to do it. And then all of a sudden we're in our driveway. Okay. And this happens to us in our personal lives. Anyone who's gone to the grocery store and then come out of the grocery store can't remember where you put your car. Something we do procedurally. So one of the things I recommend is that you pay attention that if you go into the field, you're going into clients' neighborhoods and homes, that every time you do that, it's a new adventure, it's a new thing. Because there's something procedural about driving to a neighborhood, finding the street, finding a parking spot, getting out of your car and walking that we don't think about. So we want to pay attention in our environments all the time. There's this thing that we have that nothing bad has happened here, so I don't need to pay as much attention. So we want to pay attention all the time. It's not about being paranoid. It's just about how do we pay attention, just paying attention. It's a new experience each and every time. Now, among the handouts, there is a one about environmental safety awareness. And I invite you to download this. It has some good practical ideas about maintaining safety awareness in the office environment, if you see clients in your office or at your agency. And then on the other side of it, it's about environmental safety awareness in the neighborhoods and the community and the homes you go into. And you can read these as just some points to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier about the defensive driving idea and the preventative maintenance that we can do, or prevention things we can do when it comes to safe driving. Well, here's one of the things that we can do when we are preparing for being with clients. And this whole idea of building harmony and accord. Well, how does that help in terms of prevention? Well, the thing about building rapport with people, it's a relationship certainly, and there's some things about it, but one of the hallmarks of rapport is that you don't have to have agreement to have rapport. And the reason that is because we develop respect when we have rapport. Part of that is respect. Part of it's consistency, that people know to expect of you, that you're always on time for your appointment with them. If you're ever going to be late, you let them know as soon as you can, and your reason for being late or having to cancel is a valid, legitimate one that they would understand. So there's this consistency and trust that we have. And there's a couple of advantages of this. How does it keep us safe? Well, people tend to not abuse us, beat up on us verbally, emotionally, or physically when they respect us. So having rapport definitely plays into how they'll treat us that way. Because they respect us, they're less likely to harm us. There's also another part of building harmony that's critical. Most of us wouldn't take advice from someone we didn't have rapport with. So if we build rapport, they're more likely to listen to us and hear what we have to say. So it goes to both safety and productivity. to invest in developing rapport. Next slide, please. So here's 10 things, 10 pretty good things we can do. I call them principles of listening. And I'm not going to go into detail on these because there's a handout that goes into detail, but I'll touch upon some of them. Just mentally preparing yourself to listen, removing your distractions, being focused. I recommend that people keep a to-do list and jot things down they need to do when they're not with the client, because our brains function in a way that if we put something on a to-do list, we keep thinking of it in the now. Don't forget this, don't forget this, don't forget this. We keep repeating it. By putting it on a separate piece of paper or in an electronic file, if you do your to-do list that way, it frees up your mind to pay closer attention. Removing distractions, obviously. Putting your cell phone out of sight is a better idea than just putting it face down on the table. It seems that even if the phone is in view, it's just a distraction for the potential for it to either ring or an alert to go off, or just that it's there and that you could possibly reach for it can be a distraction. A critical one also is listen to hear, not to solve. And this is one that I see a lot with helpers and healers and case managers who want to make progress. So they kind of listen only long enough to catch the data information to give an answer instead of letting the person speak. Putting the speaker at ease, empathizing. Being patient's an important one also. Sometimes people just need to tell their story, and they're not telling it for us, they're telling it because that's how they process getting to the important stuff. And with having heavy caseloads and wanting to make progress, sometimes it can be an investment of listening a little longer, being patient with them to get to the heart of the story. Okay? The avoid personal bias is about, because oftentimes you're hearing a lot of negative stories about how families aren't doing well, that kind of builds up. And we tend to look at the next client or family because over the past several days, we've had a lot of challenges. We start to carry that bias. It becomes a bias that we carry forward to the next one. So to be mindful of that. The rest of these you can look at in more detail on the principles of listening handout. But these are just ideas, just prevention, things we can do ahead of time that create a better environment that people are less likely to come after us. Next slide, please. So how do we communicate? How do we communicate? There's three modalities we communicate in. One is our nonverbals and body language. There's a lot of information just in these pictures. People share a lot. If you look at these 4 pictures, you can tell what's going on for these people. No words yet, no voice, just their body language, facial expression sends meaning. So that's one way we can convey meaning to others. Next slide, please. Another way is our nonverbals. Our voice, how we use it. I want to point out that the underlying caption of body language, facial expression should read tone of voice, use of voice, pitch, tone, cadence. But those things also send meaning. When people are frightened, they tend to get quiet and their voice cracks. When people are excited, their voice gets louder. When they're angry, it tends to get higher and faster. So there's lots of information here in just the voice. And then next slide, please. Our actual word choice. Words have meaning. And why this is so critical, a couple reasons. One is oftentimes, well, when we hear or use a word, we often aren't using the definition from the dictionary. We're using our experience and understanding of the word. So for instance, if I were to say the word house, each person will go to their understanding of house. Some people will go to a picture of the house they grew up in. Some people go into the house they currently live in. Some people have a feeling about home, safety, security when they think of house. Some people form a picture of a stick figure house of lollipop trees. Any one of those is okay. It's just that when we do this, we're going to our definition of the word house. And it's kind of charming when we think about this, but if we're working with a client and we make a different meaning of their word than they had in mind, and we run with that, they're going to get the notion that we're not listening. And in a sense, we're not. So when we're working with people and they use a word that maybe they're using it a little differently, or the word has some ambiguity to it, or they're not using it in a context that we would think you would, it's important to stop and figure out quickly by maybe asking them, what do they mean by that? Because if they think we're not listening, it just aggravates them. We can the next slide, please. So these are the ways we communicate, and people mostly use these already. You know, if you think about when you're trying to figure out if someone's not being honest with you, you tend to use these things. When they're not being honest, you may be looking for them to avert their gaze. The voice tends, the higher the pitch at the end of their sentence, the more likely they're farther from the truth. Sometimes they do ums or ers, which is a stall technique because they weren't prepared to answer the question you asked, and they have to think for a minute how it fits into their story. And sometimes at the level of words, they provide too much information. Sometimes they'll talk about how honest they are. And these are things that we already do to tell if someone is not being honest with us. So we already know how to look at people and listen to them and figure out some things. So what I'm going to do, we can go to the next slide. So if there's any questions about what I've covered so far, I'd be happy to answer some of those.
There are no questions yet. Dan, go on ahead.
Okay, we can do that too. So the idea is, and what I want to cover are the 3 emotional states that case managers and other helpers and healers come into contact with most often, that are the greatest challenge, and ones that we would benefit from recognizing early so we can start doing an intervention. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Oftentimes, clients are frustrated. And if you think about it, frustrations from not having a goal met at all or met in time, met fast enough, and it's intensified if there's a sense of loss of power or control over one's destiny. Case managers are working with people who need goals met. And every emotional state has a constellation, I call it, of expressions in terms of body language, facial expression, tone of voice, and word choice. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So here's the things that people do when they're frustrated. They tend to roll their eye, the exasperated sigh. Oftentimes they're repeating themselves and they're repeating the goal. They think you're not paying attention to the goal. They keep repeating it. Oh, they'll blame, the client's thinking, if I had my way, I'd have all my needs met. But you people, you hear that a lot, the blame words. They may threaten, if you don't get me what I want. They may be so upset and grieving the loss, they're not going to get the goal that they cry. So here's the things that people do when they're frustrated. If we were to see several of these, we might not know what the frustration's about, but we would know that this person's frustrated. Next slide, please. Fear is also common, and it's the real or perceived expectation of some type of danger or pain, whether physical or emotional. And the key part here is real or perceived expectation. If they think something bad is going to happen to them, if they think they're in danger, whether or not they are or not, but if they believe it to be so, they're going to be frightened. So it doesn't have to be that we understand them to not be in fear. If they believe it, they could be frightened. Next slide. So here are the expressions that people do when they're frightened. They tend to create space by pushing back in the chair, moving away. They hide their eyes. If they don't see the threat isn't there, they'll either run from the room or sometimes they'll dissociate. Some of them are the physiologicals preparing for the fight, flight, freeze. For instance, you'll see this on lighter complexions. The blood is moving away from the surface of the skin, concentrating internally in the body. That's why they sweat, the eyes get bigger. They look around, they get quiet. The pleading and apologizing, particularly in the work that caseworkers do, oftentimes the client has made some decisions and choices that have some painful consequences, and they will plead and apologize to avoid having to pay the consequence. I'm sorry, I didn't know. I promise I won't do that again. Again, these are some of the things you would see when someone who is in fear. Next slide, please. By the way, there is a handout for this as well. Okay. Anger is an expression of another emotion, particularly fear, annoyance, betrayal, frustration, helplessness, hopelessness. Any emotion can drive anger. And we need to think about anger as a secondary emotion indicating how upset or how intense the primary emotion is. And it's not uncommon for more than one emotion to drive anger. In fact, fear and frustration often pair up to drive anger. The person's frustrated about not getting some important goal, and they're frightened about what's going to happen when they don't get it. Often people can use anger as a way of changing your behavior. They know that if they rage and carry on, it might intimidate the person into changing their decision or changing their mind. And there's a way to tell if someone's doing this. If someone's genuinely angry, and then you give in or tell them that they get their goal met, what they want, they still are a little bit angry, and it kind of diminishes a little bit over time till they're calm again. If someone's raging and then you give them their goal or say, okay, we'll get this for you, and then all of a sudden they're just happy, chances are that was a fake. You know, emotions generally don't, particularly intense emotions, don't generally go on, off. It's not a switch like that, okay? And then sometimes people will use anger as a way of numbing themselves, that instead of feeling guilt or shame about something, they will rage as a way of not feeling guilt or shame about something they've done. Okay. Next slide, please. And again, familiar with these things, voice goes up, although sometimes they will, the voice may go down if they're also frustrated when they're angry. Cussing and swearing shows up, fidgeting, making fists, they're tightening up, preparing for their fight. If you would hear someone expressing this level of intensity and you hear them repeat themselves, chances are that the anger is driven in part at least by frustration. They tend to move in, it's more aggressive. Again, the physiologicals, you're not going to see it on all complexions, but on lighter complexions, you'll see a redness to the skin tone. And again, the things you would expect from someone who is angry. Next slide, please. So here is all the ones that we just covered, all the constellation of expressions. And if you look at these lists, you might notice, first of all, they're very similar. Crying's on all of them, fidgeting's on all of them, cussing's on all of them. Summit's on 2 of them. So they're very similar. But as similar as they are, if you look closely, you'll notice that each emotional state has some things that are only on that particular emotional state. For instance, that eye roll and that exasperated sigh is only in frustration. The moving away, eyes getting bigger, only in fear. Moving in, eyes getting smaller. Ranting, only in anger. So they're like markers or identifiers for each one. Also, if you look within each list, there are things that are subtle and things that are more obvious. Rolling the eyes is subtle, glaring and staring in frustration is more obvious. Fidgeting is subtle, pounding on the table obvious. If you look at these, each list has something like this within its list. And the beauty of this is there's this thing in human nature called personal expression precedes personal awareness, that oftentimes people don't realize they're telegraphing in subtle ways what's going on for them. And one of the most common ones of this, you've ever had someone who is clicking their pen rapidly, which is a sign of frustration. They're clicking their pen and they have no idea that they're doing it. And you call them out, could you please stop clicking the pen? They're like, what do you mean? You've been clicking the pen for 10 minutes. And they had no idea. Many of us have been on the receiving end of that we were drumming our fingers or shaking our leg or snapping our gum, whatever it was, and had no idea. So the beauty of this is that oftentimes if we're paying attention to the emotional states, particularly how they're expressing themselves through their modalities of facial expression, body language, tone of voice, and use of words, that oftentimes we'll know what's going on for them before they do. Now, if you were sitting across from a client, let's say, you notice that this client was fidgeting, this client was a little teary, and this is a client that typically doesn't cuss, but today they're doing some mild expletives. Okay? Given those 3 things, you wouldn't know what list they're on. But if you were to ask this client a question, and the initial response is they roll their eyes and say, how many times you have to do the same thing. We never, well, by the eye roll and that verbalized sigh, you would know this person's frustrated. Okay? So the question, to some extent, is who cares what emotional state they're in? They're acting up, they're being difficult, they need to fix it. Well, the reason we want to figure out what emotional state they're in is because the intervention will be different for each one. For instance, if someone was frustrated, there was some goal they were working on, and you treated them as if they were frightened, they would probably take that as you were patronizing them because they want to work on the goals. If you had someone who was frightened and you started solving for their goals, they are going to be overwhelmed. They're going to be overwhelmed. Many of us have had this experience in our life where a friend or colleague or a family member was struggling with something. They came to us and were sharing their fears and concerns, and we had a very simple solution for them, something very easy to do, and we offer it up to them. And what happens? They can't do it. Why? Because the fear is getting in the way, and it tends to overwhelm or terrify them. So until we calm people down from fear, they're not going to listen and pay attention. Okay? So next slide. So the intervention for frustration, we want to ask them a goal. If we see the eye roll and the sigh, we still might want to ask them specifically, is there some unmet goal? Is there some goal that you want to work on? Is there a goal that we're missing here today? And the reason is, if you catch it early on them before they're aware of it, if you ask questions like, is there something bothering you? Is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Because they're not thinking of this yet, it's in their subconscious still, it's a little harder to get to. But by using the word goals, it may help for them to realize that's what it's about. Okay? Once you realize it's a goal, I do recommend for case managers that you do this secondary step of identifying the goal as reasonable, lofty, or impossible. The reason is oftentimes case managers will frustrate themselves by taking on impossible tasks. And what happens is oftentimes case managers will look at their client holistically and start to help them with things that are someone else's job to do or someone is better able to do. So just an intermediary step so we make sure that we're not taking on more than is ours. Once we figure out the goal is reasonable or lofty, we're going to work on ways to obtain that goal. Understand that lofty goals tend to take longer to achieve. And oftentimes, clients are very impatient. So, and by lofty, I mean goals that have a bigger payoff that take a greater investment of time and energy and effort. So we want to keep them apprised of how long this is going to take. If the goal is impossible, we want to be honest with them unless it compromises your safety. I'm okay with telling lies to someone if that's the only way to get to safety. If someone says, you're not leaving this room till I get what I want, then I'm going to choose to lie so I can get to safety and then deal with the lie and consequences later. The other thing is, particularly if it's an important goal they're after, I recommend that you have an alternative goal waiting for them. The recipe to make a client dangerous is have them in a frightened state of mind or a frustrated state of mind, where they're not going to get something that's very, very important, and then take away all hope. It can put them in the nothing left to lose category. And if you don't have something else to offer them, then there's you have no value to them anymore. If that's all you can do for them, that's it. Now you're on your own. If you have no value, we don't respect what you don't value. So they are going to be upset about not getting this important goal, and we want to give them hope to work on the next goal so it's productive for them and they see us as being valuable. Next slide. When it comes to fear, generally we know not to move in towards someone in fear until you're sure you are not the cause of their fear, or until you're invited in. When someone's frightened, anything moving towards them is a challenge and can cause them to lash out. Oftentimes fear is them taking a bit of information, whether it's true or not, whether it applies to them or not, they play it out as if it were reality and they own it that way. And again, that's that when fear is not real, but their perception is they're in danger. More information may help. It can be hard for people. Again, if they're frightened, they're hard to reason with. one technique that can work. Oftentimes when someone's doing this, they're looking about what's going to happen. They're not at risk in the moment, but they're afraid about what's going to happen. If you can bring them to the present moment, about you're not in danger now, so we can talk about this. You know, here, now, today with me, here's what we can do. Here's what we can talk about, and try to pull them back from what might happen. And if you can pull them back to the current reality. But one thing that we can always do is reassure and comfort them. You're not going to go through this alone. I'm going to be here with you every step of the way. We're going to work through this. If you have any questions, I will answer them. If there's any question I don't have the answer for today, I will get it to you as soon as possible. And how you handle and how you reassure them and comfort them will depend upon your job description and what you know about the client. But we definitely want to reassure and comfort them. Next slide. Now, when it comes to anger, you don't want to ask a lot of questions, and you certainly don't want to ask them, "You mad about something?" Because they'll tell you. They will definitely tell you. But one thing we might do is validate the anger. Oftentimes, this big expression is them conveying how upset they really are, how intense that primary emotion is. So when we say, that we get it, we understand, I'd be angry too, and we validate it, they don't have to convince us anymore. Okay? We get it, we can move on. So we can validate their anger when appropriate. There's times when, you might not want to, but mostly we can validate their anger when it's legitimate. We also want to be aware of our own triggers. What happens is we get triggered. Sometimes people yelling either at us or just people arguing in front of us can trigger us. And what's happening is we're now sliding into our fear, and we're now dealing with our emotion, our concern about our safety, and not their issue. And if you're starting to do this, realize that you're going to start being less effective at de-escalating. That you're more likely at this point to be slipping into your survival brain. We're going to start throwing out being confrontational and blaming, which isn't going to help the situation. So we all came by it honestly about where our triggers are. It's good to know where they are and realize when you're getting triggered, if you can bring yourself back from that and calm yourself down, that's good. If you can't, it's probably time to remove yourself early. We want to find the cause of the anger. Our first initial steps are to bring down this intense expression to find out what the true emotion is. We want to calm them down. Okay? So we want to set clear behavioral limits. It's okay to be angry. It's not okay to threaten me, break things, kick things, throw things around the room. I'm okay with you being angry. You're expressing yourself. I get it. Anger really, in some sense, is an intense request for something to be different. Okay, we can deal with the request. How you're going about yelling and screaming is not going to work. So we want to validate the anger, that they have a reason to be angry in often cases, but how they express it. Also, we want to pay attention to their visual focus, because people in anger tend to look at what they're going to vent on or with, which is why keeping your table or desktop clear, or being aware of what's in front of this person, they're getting angry, because if something is laying in front of them, that's what they're going to pick up and throw. If they're looking directly at you and glaring, they're going to come after you, at least verbally, if not possibly physically. So pay attention to the visual focus. Okay? So with these three emotional states, if we're there early enough and we're paying attention, they may telegraph what's going on for themselves, what emotional state they're in, before they realize it. They didn't realize they rolled their eyes. They didn't realize that they're pushing back in the chair. And in anger, something as simple as they're kind of warming up their fists as they're agreeing with you. You say, "Is that okay? Can we go ahead with this?" And they're saying yes, but they're shaking their head back and forth as if to say no, and they're warming up their fist a little bit. They don't realize they're doing this, but they're telling us they're disagreeing with us, and they're moving into anger. Okay? And then you want to do an intervention for each one that's appropriate and coincides with that particular emotional state. Next slide, please. So do we have any questions yet?
There aren't currently any questions in the chat, in the question box. If you guys do have questions, be sure to type them in and we'll get to them. There'll be another chance to ask questions. So back to you, Dan.
Okay, we can save all the questions for the end. That can work too. So action steps, some general things we want to do. Generally speaking, maintaining eye level with people is the best. There's a notion who's ever standing is in power and control. My recommendation is if you're seated, when someone comes into the room and you don't know them, I recommend that you stand up to meet them eye to eye. I also recommend if someone's coming into the room, whether or not you know them, but you can see that they're emotionally charged, that you stand up to meet them eye to eye. I don't mean leap out of the chair into action. I mean rise to meet them, because if this person's upset with you and you remain seated and they stand in front of you, particularly if they start pointing at you, it's hard to stand up. You'd have to lean forward to counterbalance. That ends up headbutting them, which is not a good thing. It doesn't help de-escalate them. So meeting people eye to eye. Keeping yourself calm, not just taking a breath, but regular breathing can help keep us calm. Also asking yourself questions when they're starting to get upset, because our brain can easily be tricked that just because someone's yelling doesn't mean we're in danger. So if we were to ask ourselves questions like, who are they yelling at? Who's the object of their anger? So if you take a moment and recognize, okay, they're not yelling at me, they're yelling about someone outside the room they have an issue with, or maybe someone in the room they have an issue with. So when we do that kind of assessment, it helps us keep calm and keep in the rational thinking part of our brain, because when we get triggered, we tend to go to our survival brain. So by asking ourselves questions and doing that kind of assessment, it can help keep us calm. How do we calm other people? One is by modeling it. If we model calmness and regulate our breathing, it tends to reduce triggering them. Another way to calm somebody down is to get them to sit down. If they're standing up, inviting them to sit down. Number one, it helps them focus their energy, and it's good feedback. If they can sit down, they're telling us they're in control of themselves. If they can't sit down, they're letting us know that their energy is up and scattered. Another way to get people to calm down, particularly when they're starting to get angry and starting to rant, is by writing it down. Writing it down signifies to them that what they're saying is important and that you're paying attention. And most people recognize that you can't write as fast as they can talk, so it slows them down. Another thing you can do with this technique to stop a rant is, as if they say something, they're on a rant and they say something that you want to talk about, you just wrote it down, you can point to it and say, hey, I'm glad you brought that up, that's really good. Let's talk about that, and it stops the rant. Setting clear behavioral limits and physical boundaries. Again, we often forget, we're not paying close enough attention how close they're getting, that they're moving in. So we would pay attention to how they're treating us as well, because we train people on how they're going to treat us. And by not saying anything, we give tacit approval for that behavior. So you want to set clear boundaries about how they get to behave. Again, it's going back to, it's okay to be angry, but you don't get to threaten me doing it. To maintain 2 arms length for a person that you feel might get physical and you're still talking to them, you want to still have a dialogue with them. When they say 2 arms length, it's actually just beyond 2 arms length. When you're standing 2 arms length away, you should be able to look into the person's face, and while looking in their face, without shifting your gaze, but in your peripheral vision, see their feet. If you can do that, you're far enough away that you'll be able to see them if they try to make a move, and you'll have enough distance to react. Okay? And then, use body language to send visual cues by nodding our head when they're talking, leaning back a little bit to give them space. They're picking up on these cues subtly, so we want to be mindful of how we use our bodies when we're expressing. Okay. Next slide, please. And again, some of these are questions we want to pay attention to, because when we think in these questions, it helps us keep grounded in what's really going on and not letting our mind run away with itself. That's one of the biggest challenges in safety. We drop into our survival brain, we're not thinking clearly. So some of these questions that keep us in our mind, in our thinking rationally, are: will the behavior exhaust itself? That's another way of saying that. Do I just need to let them vent? Because if they need to vent to de-escalate and I interrupt that, it's just going to frustrate them. So do I need to let them just get it out of their system? Who is the behavior a danger to? What's the target of the behavior? Again, when we get triggered, we stop paying attention to this, And then we don't always recognize when the real danger is there because we're so confused because we're in that part of our survival brain. Is physical violence unavoidable? We want to leave long before that. And then, do you need to leave? And it seems like a pretty basic, simple question. But again, this happens frequently with case managers and helpers and healers, that they get so focused and so intent on working with this client or solving whatever their issue they have, that they lose sight of what the client is doing otherwise or what other people in the room are doing. So we want to pay attention to what's going on in a larger scope, and deciding to make that decision to leave, and leaving early is not a bad choice. I'd rather make the mistake and leave early than say, I wish I'd have left earlier. Okay. Next slide. Understand that you are going to react. When something surprises you, shocks you, or doesn't make sense to you, you're probably going to make a face about it. And oftentimes, because clients are often living in fear, when people are in fear, they tend to look for the negatives. They tend to look for what's a risk or danger. And they tend to make negative interpretations of your expression. So realize they're going to react to that. Another thing that can help is understanding and recognizing the limits of your patients. And on any given day, maybe other things are going on in your professional, personal life, or with this particular client that you've been not having a lot of success with, and they're frustrating you. Realize that can show up in your attitude, and just give yourself permission that today you just don't have as much patience as you normally do. You might even want to modify how much time you spend with that particular client that day, just to get maybe one or two things done instead of the full agenda that you had. At least you could have a little bit of a success and not try to push it when you're not feeling patient. What they need, oftentimes they do need to talk about other things. If they want to talk about something that happened outside in their other part of their life that's not related to your case. The thing is, many of us this happens to us, where we have a burning issue that we want to talk about, and we run into a friend of ours and they start talking first, and what's going on for us? We're waiting for them to stop talking so we can talk about what's really important, our stuff. Well, we want to let them talk about that stuff, because the same thing will happen to them. If they have a burning issue and we don't let them vent at least a little bit about it, it's going to be distracting them from getting to the real thing. So we don't want to frustrate them any more than we need to. So we might give them a minute or two to talk about this issue, then say something like, I'm glad you shared that with me, but how about we talk about something that we can work on today, something we can do something about. So sometimes you need to invest a little time in letting them vent about other things. And also being aware of your strengths and your skills, that if this particular person is doing things that you don't have experience with, not sure what's going on, if you get a funny feeling about how this is going and can't figure it out quickly, I recommend you figure it out from farther away. If their behavior is becoming somewhat challenging, like, I'm not sure what to do here, it's okay to leave. We all have our limit. So just recognizing that this client is being a little more difficult than you know how to handle today, at this point, it's okay to remove yourself. Okay. Next slide, please. Something else that's really, really critical in terms of the work that you do is self-care. There are days when you're going to be running from one client to the next client to the next client, or days when you're just be overwhelmed by everything that's on your plate. And I highly recommend that case managers take time as often as they can, even between each and every client, if they can, to do a little personal check-in. By personal check-in, I don't mean review the case notes for the next client. I mean taking a moment to see how you're doing. What's your level of frustration today? How are things going? Because what can happen, that thing I mentioned before about personal expression precedes personal awareness, it happens to us as well. And how it can show up is that it's been a rough day. You've already seen 2 or 3 clients. It's not been going well. It's been very frustrating. You've had a difficult week at work with a lot of clients. And you go to the next client's home, and because you're not aware of how frustrated you are just yet, when you go to knock on their door, instead of a gentle knock, you don't realize how hard you're really rapping on the door. And they're going to be wondering, who's pounding on my door? The same thing can happen if you're delivering or walking your client down to the lobby your next client's waiting, and that client you're walking down the lobby is frustrating you, and as you say goodbye, you don't realize you just did an eye roll and a sigh. And the second client who's waiting, who's next, sees that, they may think that frustration is about them. So it could be just dropping off that one client, thanking them, acknowledging the next client being there, then saying, I just need a minute or two, I'll be right back with you. You collect yourself, and then you go on to the next client. Okay, it's a very, very important concept. Next slide. So the way I look at it is this. You know, when you're on a commercial airline and the flight attendant says, you know, if you're traveling with a child or anyone who's acting like a child, you're supposed to put on your own oxygen first. Well, you know, in most cases, that'd be considered selfish. You have a person who's panicking and you're taking care of your own self first. Well, most people would say, well, you can't take care of anybody else until you take care of yourself in that situation. Well, that's true. I also apply it to the work that case managers do, that it is okay to take care of yourself first, not only just first, because if you're not taking care of you and aware of what's going on for you and not paying attention and trusting your gut, because that's a big part of safety, trusting your gut, how will you be able to take care of anybody else? So that's the whole idea of the self-care, of taking care of yourself throughout the day. It's also, you get to include yourself in the caring, because you do a lot of caring for your clients and taking care of them. I recommend that the case managers include themselves in that caring thing. And by doing this on a regular basis through the day, it helps you reduce your frustration through the day. It helps you be more aware, and it also helps you from dumping on your loved ones at the end of the day, that you've let off some of the steam during the day. Okay. Next slide. So, do we have any questions?
We do. This is Lori, and Tammy, I'll let you do the one after this. The first one is, how does one know when the line has been crossed and you're not safe?
Okay, great question. It's called trusting your gut. That funny feeling that you get. For some people, it's the pit of their stomach. Some people get a tingling sensation down their neck or their arms, or trembling or dryness in the mouth. What's happening is you're physiologically preparing for fight, flight, or freeze. And what's really going on is we're constantly monitoring what's going on around us and comparing it to what our idea of safety is. And when something around us matches up with what our understanding of danger is, our body will automatically and uncontrollably go to the fight, flight, freeze response. And that's why it's different for different people. We all have different experiences of what we believe danger is. We learned this, a lot of it, from what our parents or caregivers taught us, what we've experienced in life. When you get that funny feeling, I recommend you quickly try to assess what it is that you're seeing or hearing. And if you can figure it out quickly and make a decision and adjust. And sometimes you're not really in danger. Someone behaves in a way that, oh, okay. You know, think about if you were at a party or something and someone came up to you, started walking towards you, they gave you a creeped out feeling, and they said hello, and you got a really creeped out feeling, then realize this person looks and sounds like a boss that you had years ago who used to bully you and intimidate you. You'd realize, okay, I know I got that feeling, but it's not the same person. I'm safe. Obviously, if someone was looking at you in a glaring kind of way and slowly moving towards you with a funny look on their face, yeah, that's danger. If you're in a situation where you're getting that funny feeling, particularly if it's coming on strong and you cannot figure it out quickly what is really going on, then my recommendation is figure it out from farther away. Just remove yourself, because even if you were wrong about that situation, you're still safe. So the biggest thing you can do, your early warning system, is trust your gut. If you can figure it out quickly, great. If not, remove yourself. Any other questions?
What's the best way for workers to calm themselves when dealing with an upset client?
Okay. Breathing is a good one. What you think about, you focus more on. So if you are looking at the client as if they're a threat or a danger, or treat them as if they're a threat or a danger, they tend to rise to that. So we want to calm ourselves, think, I can handle this, I'm paying attention. The biggest thing is keeping in the rational part of your brain by saying, what's the threat? Am I at risk? And if you get that sense that you're really at risk, it's okay to remove yourself.
Okay, there's a comment here that says, I think it helps to emphasize the helping role of APS rather than its authority as a government agency. I'm assuming you would agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. What's your opinion on carrying mace or some other type of item to defend yourself at a visit? What should a worker do if someone comes at them?
Okay. Part of it would be if you have a state law that regulates that, also what your agency says. Some agencies don't allow it. Pepper spray, if you're allowed to carry it, you want to know the limitations of it. If you're going to use it, that it has a shelf life on it, that the propellant in it, the aerosol or the gas, gets weak over time, so you have to replace it every so often. Also, if it's in the bottom of your purse or bag or somewhere buried, that you have to get to it, that's a challenge. There's also a challenge. I've worked with agencies who've considered doing pepper spray. The issue that they have is that when word gets out that their case managers are carrying pepper spray, it sends a message to the community that the workers are armed. It also sends a message to the people being served, the clients, that the agency thinks we're dangerous. My belief is that, and I do teach a full force physical self-defense training. I prefer that because, I don't carry pepper spray, but I have my hands and my elbows and my knees and my feet at the ready at all times. So I don't have to worry about carrying something. So I'm not against pepper spray as long as your agency and your laws of your state allow you to use it. But realize that you have to have it at the ready. It has to be less than 3 years old. And the other thing is, it doesn't always work instantaneously on all people. So if you can spray them, but they still may get to you.
Okay, what are your thoughts about clients who bring in walking sticks or other items that might be used as a weapon? Do you have any advice around whether workers should say anything?
Well, it's all part of who they are. I mean, if they're using that as a legitimate mobility device, they need that. It's part of them. But I would incorporate that into what they're doing with it, how they're using it. And also, because it extends the 2 arms length we talked about, I keep farther away. If it were that concern or they had a history of using this, then I might address that by, you have to leave this by the door or something like that. It's somewhat case specific, but I would incorporate it into their history and their behavior in the past and what they're doing in the moment.
Okay, I think we're at the top of the hour. Do we want to try to do one more? Should at any point, should a worker run in fear of his or her safety?
Yes.
That's a good answer.
Except, okay. Yes, running is good. Getting away from it is good. The only exception to that, we didn't talk about this, is when it's a dog. Running from dogs, seriously, it only engages the dog to run harder and faster. The only time to run is if you can get over the fence, into your car, into the building, whatever, before the dog can get to you. But running is not a bad thing if you're in that much danger. Running and having a place to run to is the next part. Just running away, you know where to run to. And that's also something that can be covered in more depth when we talk about environmental awareness and having safe places in mind already.
Okay. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I see we are at the end of our hour, and I really appreciate, Dan, for you spending time with us and giving us an excellent presentation. I'm still lucky enough to be able to say that you did come to Las Vegas and to Reno several years ago to do a safety training for us. It's been a while, but we all still remember that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Jason, do you have the final TARC slide to put up?
I do. So as I said before, this slide shows the contact information for the TARC. So if you want to join us on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn, the handout has clickable links. Our website is listed below the contact us, as well as the support email address. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to call us, or if you want to or email us. If you want to get in touch with us about some kind of technical assistance, you can use any of those methods to contact us. And again, I want to thank NAPSA, Tammy, and Dan for providing this great webinar.
Thank you, everyone.